Have y'all heard of Solarpunk? It's basically a version of the future where people don't destroy the planet. A lot of green energy and stuff like that. It's great. But since it seems like we're destined towards the WALL-E future, I'm coping by building a city in Minecraft. To start off, we're going to need somewhere to build, so let's make some terrain. Using a Terrace command, I can use a noise pattern to generate some basic terrain fairly quickly. This is a 1500 by 1500 block area, so I think it should be enough space, but it's kind of empty right now. Using a similar command, I can create a set of mountains that I can copy and paste around the edges of the terrain. And the first area that we're going to be building in is going to be a wheat field, so let's start laying out that area. There are a lot of mountains here, so I need to use some special techniques in order to texture them in a reasonable amount of time. I'm going to use a method that I learned from my friend Shovel. Using a command, I can generate placeholder blocks in shadowed and unshadowed areas. Then, using two different gradient columns, I can color in each segment fairly easily. Even with all of these commands, it still takes quite a while just because of how much there is to do. Alright, it's time to start on our first building. For this build, I'm taking inspiration from Archigram's plugin architecture from the 1960s. Basically, their whole idea was that you had a capsule-like structure that was prefabricated, and that could also be moved around pretty easily. Hence, this way you could have a building that could essentially plug it in to larger buildings, and then can be moved around from place to place as the owner would deem fit. So to take from that, I want the main structure of this build to be capsule-like, and I want it to be something that seems like it could be easily moved from place to place. The one I'm making right now is going to be for wheat fields, but it should be able to be adapted into several environments. Prefabricated architecture is actually something that people are looking into in the real world right now. The whole idea is that making something offsite is supposed to be more time and material efficient. For this build, to keep in line with the environmental impact sort of things, I want to make the structure affect the surrounding environment as little as possible. That's why I'm trying to keep it raised above the ground to keep the footprint of the building as small as I can. Alright, y'all are going to be proud of me. I actually made an interior this time. You go in through the bottom and enter this sort of silo area. Go up the ladder to enter the living space. Over here there's a kitchen and bunks. And on the other side there's this cool little indoor gardening area that personally just makes me happy. In the majority of Solarpunk art that I've seen, there's been these floating wind turbine kite things, and they just seem too cool for me not to include, so I'm going to make some to spread around the city. The trick with making these was making sure that each segment of the balloon is distinct, which is a lot easier said than done, because on this scale, each segment really wants to blend together to one misshapen cylinder. On the inside, I used observers, lodestones, and blast furnaces to make a sort of inner core for the turbine to spin around. I feel like these little guys are really good at adding a bit of life to the area. They're also a good start to the city's electrical system, which reminded me I need solar panels. I mean, what is Solarpunk without the solar? For the solar panels, it was really difficult for me to get that solar panel-y blue color. It's a really deep blue that you don't really use too often. I went through so many different attempts before I realized that sculpt blocks actually have the perfect color for solar panels. So then all I've got to do is pop a few of them around, add some power lines, and then we have what looks like an electrical system. For the next building, I'm going to make a botany research station. I wanted this building to be more cabin-like, but I do want it to have a bit of a modern aesthetic. The shape was pretty difficult for me to figure out. I tried a few different types of barn shapes that I ended up not really liking. I eventually ended up with this sort of split roof design that I liked a lot better. The building needs to be able to let in a fair bit of sunlight in order to keep all the plants alive, so I made sure to include a lot of window space. I also decided I wanted to put a circular glass dome tower thing on the top. I wanted to have an easy way to recognize that there were plants inside of this building from the outside. And of course, I need to put a solar panel on the roof. It does make for pretty easy detail, and I am also trying to make as many of the buildings as I can capable of generating at least some power on their own. On the inside, the building's filled with greenery. There's tall ceilings so that you can see up through to the greenhouse tower that I made, with a little tree hanging in its pot. Of course, there's quite a bit of space for research stations. One thing in here I wanted to show y'all was this little bush design that I've been using. It's not too complicated, it's just a carrot crop on top of a leaf block, but it does help to make the leaves look a little bit more fluffy. Now, I know this design isn't struggle friendly, but it is quite useful for adding just a little bit of detail here and there. Now I need to actually work on the area that the botany center is going to go. I was thinking of a forested type of area, so I made a group of pine trees that I could paste in to make a forest. When you're making a forest, it's important to include different heights of trees. You need to have a set of trees that can make up the canopy layer of leaves on top, and some smaller younger trees covering up some space on the bottom. It can help a bit to think through the way that each tree will be getting its light. The bulk of the tree should be the older, taller trees that make up the canopy because they're taking up the most light, but then in between those, you can add a few younger trees that can gather up any light that gets through. Telescopes are fun. Let's make an observatory. I'm going to base the telescope design off of the telescopes at the WM Keck Observatory. One of the special things about this observatory is that instead of just making one huge telescope, they made multiple smaller ones that sort of work together to make a better image. So sort of following that idea, this is going to be one of two telescopes that are going to be on this map. I want them to sort of act like they're focusing in on one point together. This building was a really good opportunity for me to figure out some little tech doodads to place around for detail. In most building styles, you have to choose between what I call tech spam and tree spam for easy detailing, but in Solarpunk it's really nice because you can actually use both at once. Speaking of tree spam, green roofs. Green roofs are basically when you incorporate natural elements into your roof. The presence of plants and shade in this way can help prevent the formation of heat islands in cities. They can also help to store rainwater, clean the air, and add a good sense of nature to the surrounding area. However, they are pretty expensive and are just in general difficult to build, so that's why you don't just see them around everywhere. But I don't really have to deal about these things because this is Minecraft, so I can basically just put green roofs wherever the hell I want. I'm basing the interior on a NASA control room. The area is going to be filled with desks and workstations that are in front of a few main display monitors. For this bit, I got a little help from my man Rail, who is a lot better at interior detailing than I am. He noticed that I was kinda struggling, so he popped in for a bit to grace us with his ultimate interior wisdom. Alright, I spent enough time making standalone buildings at this point. Let's start in the residential area of the city. To get started, I'm going to make a few smaller units with different shapes. I'm keeping the structure fairly simple because there's going to be a lot of them. I'm giving them a flat roof that could also act as an outdoor meeting space, and of course, I'm decorating them with gardens, wind turbines, and solar panels. After I got those done, I started mashing them together into several city blocks. The mashing up saves a fair bit of time, but I've still got to clean up everything by hand. By cleaning up, I mean removing the hundreds of carrots that got stuck in the walls. With all the blocks made, I need to make a rough map of the layout of the town. I'm going to sort of organize everything around these two central areas, and I'm making sure to leave room for some natural space and park areas. My goal is going to be to keep the city as walkable as possible. I think we can all agree that car-centric cities aren't great, so keeping everything more pedestrian-focused should help. After all that, I can finally add in a lot of the smaller details that really make the area feel more alive. Trees, park benches, and bridges mostly. Also, in the two central areas, I wanted to make a covered gathering area around these interesting windmill designs I found. I made the coverings curved based on a sinusoidal pattern, and placed some foliage, carrots, on the top. Before I start on the downtown city area, I kinda want to break from that last bit. And also, I have another standalone building that I want to make. Anyways, we're building a weather station. A lot of the green energy sources, wind and solar, really rely on the weather conditions being right, so it would make sense for them to put a lot of energy into analyzing the weather. While I was starting to work on the building, I also decided I wanted to make these weather monitoring poles, similar to these little things that you might have seen around your area if you look hard enough. The weather center was based on a model from a design competition that I found. I liked the general shape and layout, as well as the partly covered pathways. I wanted the area to be centered around one of those cool wind turbines from earlier. It's used to generate power for the site, and can also be used to monitor the wind patterns. On the inside of the building, of course they need to be studying the climate and these biome research things. And on the other side of the site, they're also studying cyclones, in this room that I based on something I remember seeing from the game Outer Wilds, which by the way, if you haven't played it, I really recommend. For the downtown section of the city, I wanted to go for a terrace structure. There can be different types of buildings on each layer, and there will be plenty of green space in between the buildings. I started out with these two enormous sections, with a central area for navigation in between. And then for the terrace structure, I was going to use this sharper curved bit as an overhang on each terrace section, but to be honest, I didn't really like where this is going. First of all, with walkability being an important thing for the city, with sections this large, I couldn't really figure out a way to get people from one side to the other without it taking a really long time. Also, a friend of mine told me these rings looked like onion rings, and I really couldn't get that out of my head. So I scrapped what I had and started with something new. I had been working on the previous design for about 3 days at this point, so starting over didn't feel great, but I did have a bit more hope for this new design. First of all, we're scrapping the onion rings. We're going for a more simplified shape that should be easier to texture and add details to later. Also, we're making the islands much smaller. Instead of having 2 massive islands, we're going to have 11 or so much smaller islands. I'm starting off just working on the bottom sections of these islands. I am still going for a terrace design, but I want to have the space to work up top already so I can visualize what I'm going to do later. I decided that the bottom layer of these structures should be a more commercial area. I'm going to put bridges in between the sections later so that you can easily move between the islands. For now, I'm just making the public path space around the islands and plotting out the spaces inside for the businesses to go. While the rest of the islands are being finished, I wanted to show you all a lifesaver of a plugin. Enter Easy Edits, an extremely powerful plugin that may have some of the most confusing commands you'll ever see. There's a lot of math that I don't understand. There's different noise types, patterns, masks, as well as flow fields, whatever the hell those are. I use it for texturing. Watch this. Boom, instant texturing instead of what would have taken an hour. I'll be honest, y'all, texturing is just about all I know how to do with it yet. There is a lot. And most of the plugins still being produced, so things might change, which is great. But it's still extremely useful and is saving me a ton of time. Anyways, after I got finished with all of those islands, I needed a bit of a break. So let's move on to that second observatory I promised. Since this is the second one, I gotta save a lot of time by yoinking and doinking details I already made in the first observatory. That one was powered by solar, so I want this one to be powered by wind. I remember a little bit ago learning about these Bargeal wind towers that essentially funnel in wind and act as a traditional form of air conditioning. Now, I know this isn't exactly the same, but I liked how they looked and wanted this building to funnel wind in a similar way. And since the telescope already needs to be pretty high up, it makes sense to extend the tower up a little bit and use it as a type of wind catcher. Of course, I'm going to use that wind turbine design from earlier because I love it if you can't tell already. And then in a relatively small amount of time, I had the second observatory done, and I decided I'd fill the area around it with another wheat field, similar to the one that we started with. Moving back to the city, the upper bits of the islands were a big challenge. I started trying to block out the upper terraces, but I really couldn't come up with something that I liked. The really difficult thing for me was trying to figure out how to compose something on the scale of the city while still making it functional. I tried a few different methods, but eventually I just took a screenshot and started sketching something on top of it. A lot of the times, at least for me, sketching's a really good way to come up with ideas. Simplifying things down into a 2D space really helped me to just start churning out rough concepts. And now that I had a sketch to work off, getting the buildings placed in was so much easier. What I figured out during the sketching process is the buildings need to be so much taller than I had originally planned. In order for the build to really feel like a city, there needs to be a ton of height. When I started to actually texture in the buildings, one thing I wanted to avoid is what I'm calling the water cooler effect. I don't know exactly why, but for some reason a lot of these modern skyscraper type buildings, they start looking like water coolers after a while, and it just sort of looks weird. If you look at real skyscrapers, they use a lot of glass, but since we're in Minecraft, if you use a lot of glass in the same way, it just doesn't look quite right. You either get this weird overly transparent texture with a grid, or you get the blue water cooler blob. Anyways, my solution was fairly simple. Instead of using glass for the darker areas of the building, I just used this light gray color set instead. Something that I've always struggled with these modern builds is the large flat spaces that you always have to use. One thing that you learn early on when you start building is that large flat surfaces look terrible in Minecraft. Typically, in order to add detail to something, you need to add depth, which for modern builds isn't something you're typically supposed to do, which makes it really hard to add detail. On this scale, however, I realized since I can add shading, it really helps the build out a lot. This way I can add in a bit more detail without ruining the sleek appearance. Another thing I wanted to add into the city was some of the pod designs from earlier. Their whole point was that they could be moved in and out of places, but I still only have them in the wheat fields. So I'm going to make a tower for them to be stored in while they're in the city. The building's mostly just a frame with a crane on top to move the pods in and out. This way the pods can really combine together to make one large modular tower. In the tallest tower, I wanted to make an airship hangar. I hauled out an area inside the tower for the airships to land and take off. Then I started working on making a few airship designs, and I think they turned out good enough. I'll be honest, making vehicles really are not my strong suit, and I think it kind of shows. But I do think they'll be important for adding some life to the city. Now I need to actually worry about making this area walkable, which comes with a problem that I knew I would be needing to solve at one point, but was kind of dreading. Stairs. I need to make a building with a recognizable type of design. This way it won't be as difficult to find a way to get from level to level. I decided to go for this diagonally pointed shape, which sort of reminds me of stairs or a slope or something. I don't know, I just sort of like the design. Get off my back. Anyway, stairs. Stairs kind of suck. When you're using World Edit, they always start to connect weird, and it gets so tedious having to go around fixing all of the misconnections. Now I need to start working on the paths and greenery and stuff. I'll be honest, this process always takes a bit, but it is pretty chill. It does really add a lot to the area though. It covers up a lot of the ugly bits at the bottom of the building, and it makes the area look really nice from first person too. Alright, we can't leave all of these buildings empty. Let's make at least a few interiors. This one can be a greenhouse, naturey area, and in here we can put a reactor. Look, I know nuclear energy sort of takes away from the solar part of the Solarpunk, but nuclear energy is actually a lot better for the environment than people think. Hooray, we finished one section. Time to start on literally everything else. Don't worry though, I have a plan. The same way we pasted buildings into the residential area, I can paste things in here. I just need to take the buildings out and clean them up a bit so that they're actually pasteable. I do want to make sure that I'm not pasting the hangar tower though. It's supposed to sort of be the central point of the skyline because it's the tallest building, so pasting it around would just sort of ruin that effect. After I get all the buildings pasted in, I just sort of repeat everything I did in the first section. Staircases, plants, trees, paths, all that stuff. Since I've already done it all once, doing it again goes a little bit faster. There is another thing to worry about though, bridges. The islands being, well, islands aren't very well connected, so I need to add some bridges to fix that. We've got top section bridges, bottom section bridges, we've got all the bridges you need. They actually took a really long time to make because there's not really a good way to speed up bridgification. The vast majority of it was still just placing blocks by hand, which sucks in comparison to everything else. Plus, if you look around, there's 1, 2, 3, too many. There's too many bridges. After that though, the city's pretty much finished. I just have to add a few finishing touches here and there around the city. It was mostly just a tree here and a path there though. This is the biggest build that I've ever made, so it's already a huge step out of my comfort zone. Plus this style of building is very different from anything I've ever done before. Honestly, before this project, I think I've only built in a modern style like one time. So the majority of this project was really just me figuring out what I'm doing. I'm really proud of it though. It feels really good both from a walking and a flying point of view, which was my goal coming in. I feel like I could have made each section a little bit more cohesive if I had planned it out a bit better at the beginning, but given the amount of time this project actually took to do, I think I'll forgive myself for that. Anyways, go build something Solarpunk. I think that was the point of this video. See ya.